Welcome everyone to part two of the basically the TAE story. In part one, for those of you who weren't fortunate enough to attend last year, I talked about the run-up to the expedition, particularly the years before the tractors rolled, the decisions by the various governments involved to get involved to support the selection of the leaders, and basically took it up to 1955, which was when the personnel were being selected, but the leaders had been selected. Now tonight, I want to change that focus a little bit and talk to you about the U.S. Navy and their involvement, which was rather significant in the expedition. We'll talk about the dash to the pole. That's something that I think warrants more than just a brief mention. And I've been fortunate enough to access the diaries of both Sir Edmund Hillary and Vivian Fuchs, as well as other files in both Scott Polar Research Institute and the Auckland War Museum, and came across what I think is some quite interesting material, which I'll share with you. There's something called the cause célèbre. It's a different issue than Sir Edmund going to the pole, but it was engendered by that trip to the pole, and I'll explain that to you as well. And then we'll finish off with the sort of the wrap-up of what the TAE meant for Antarctic affairs, particularly in New Zealand. I'll reintroduce here quickly some of the key players in this story. We have Sir John Slessor, former war hero, chosen as chairman of the London TAE Committee of Management, a very high-profile individual in British society. Bunny Fuchs, leader of the CTAE, and James Wordy, also a very senior individual in polar affairs, chair of the UK Polar Committee. These people were all behind the granting of approval for Bunny Fuchs to lead the TAE and to get the TAE rolling over in the UK. In the United States, two key players, Admiral George Dufek, commander of USN Task Force 43, otherwise known as Operation Deep Freeze. And then one of his associates, a fairly controversial figure, but nevertheless a major Antarctic explorer, Finn Roney, who was busily supporting the IGY over on the eastern side of the continent. And then we have our New Zealand individuals, represented chiefly by the Ross Sea Committee. Now this photo shows key members would be Ed Hillary, of course, who was a member. This is Dr. Robert Falla, a ornithologist. We have here the chairman of the committee, Charles Bowden, a Wellington bureaucrat. We have here Arthur Helm, who was the secretary of the Ross Sea Committee and a very significant individual in the whole project, and was also Sir Edmund Hillary's main man in Wellington. And over here we have Earl Riddiford, a very accomplished mountaineer and barrister who was also a member of the Ross Sea Committee. Then we have in London Frank Horner, the New Zealand Deputy High Commissioner in London, and he was the representative for New Zealand who sat on the London Committee of Management. And in that way, the two committees were interwoven. Now, the United States made a very big investment in the International Geophysical Year and planned 7 Antarctic bases. From this Weddell station is actually also known as Ellsworth. And we then had others, Byrd Station, we had a Little America Station, we had the Adair Station, which became the joint station at Cape Hallett. There was a station on the Knox coast, and then we had the McMurdo base as well, which was intended to be mainly a logistics base. Now over here at the Weddell Sea side is also where Shackleton Base was placed by Fuchs, about 35 miles away from this station. And Halley Bay, the IGY station for the UK, is further up the coast about there. But the main point here is that New Zealand contributed £50,000 to the TAE. The American investment in the Antarctic portion of the IGY was 250 times that amount, was almost $15 million. And it's well represented by this fleet of ships, of which the 6th is where this photo was taken from. But we're talking about the largest icebreakers in the world and some very significant cargo ships. And they all sailed down to McMurdo Sound. Now, this created what we call a fear of United States involvement, and Fuchs was particularly sensitive on this issue. But it all started back in 1955 at the IGY conference. Hillary wrote this letter to Arthur Helm following the conference, and even Hillary was concerned. Distressed at the thought of a major American base cluttering up our possible base sites. Then about having different nations camped side by side can cause problems, especially when the Americans will undoubtedly be equipped and provisioned on a luxurious scale, which was absolutely the case. So this is Hillary speaking here, but Fuchs himself, as you can see from these diary entries later on in April, we have planned throughout that it is to be purely British, and I have no intention that we shall sacrifice the honors now for a mess of pottage in the form of a half-dozen barrels of fuel. Or in the same section of the diary, I'm determined we shall make our crossing as though they were not present. We must not be in the position of helping New Zealand to sell her Antarctic territory to the USA. So you can see, you get the gist here. There was either a fear of being overwhelmed by the American presence or just a standoffish attitude, which was certainly Vivian Fuchs's view of the world. Now, Hillary got over that concern very quickly, and we have here the Advance Party members, Bernie Gunn and Bill Smith, about to explore the Ferrer Glacier. Now, they were part of the New Zealand Advance Party that went down in 1955-56. It was totally at the cost and hosting of the Americans that this visit was possible. They went down with the Americans, they stayed with the Americans, they were flown all over the region by the Americans. And of particular interest is that Bernie Gunn did a very important flight with Commander Jorda of the US Navy over all the glaciers. And it was on that flight that Gunn identified the Skeleton Glacier as the best option for getting to the plateau. Now that message was eventually sent to Hillary, who at that time was on the Theron coming back to London from the Weddell Sea. And it lodged in his memory and was very useful later on. So this was an American contribution. And it's confirmed in these notes by both Trevor Hatherton, who was the person who took the previous picture, and Bernie Gunn. The transport of many hundreds of tons of stores and of many expedition members has enabled the New Zealand teams to accomplish much more than their own logistics support would have allowed. That's in the 1961 IGY bulletin. And Bernie Gunn, the greater part of the commitments of the directive for the Advance Party had been completed This was only possible because of the unstinted help and cooperation given by all members of U.S. Task Force 43. So New Zealand has the U.S. Navy to be thankful for in that regard. Now, just other events of that sort. This is a picture courtesy of Bill Cranfield. He took this one, might recognize it, Bill. This is from the Endeavour, and that is the USS Glacier coming out to aid it through the pack ice. Without that assistance, the Endeavour could not have reached Ross Island. Now, I want to talk a bit more, though, about the east side and Finn Ronnie. Finn Ronnie was also a very helpful, controversial person though he might have been. He was very helpful to Fuchs. And so Fuchs seemed to have gotten over his reluctance to accept American aid. So these are in the found in various places. Ronnie wrote this in his book, America, My Destiny. This is from Fuchs's diary. Dr. Fuchs expressed doubts that the crossing would be continued unless fuel supplies were replenished. He asked if I could help by flying 12 drums to South Ice Station. This is fuel that Fuchs had used in trying to extricate his tractors from the crevasses on the glacier trip from Shackleton Base up to South Ice. About a 300-mile trip, but it was a very difficult trip for him, and he used a lot more fuel than he thought he would, and he asked for help to fly more drums from Shackleton up to South Ice. Then there was a major issue on an accident that occurred at Halley Bay with a fellow named Robin Smart, Dr. Robin Smart. He fell and injured his liver. They needed drugs. Neither Halley Bay nor Shackleton had those drugs. They asked Ronnie if they had any at Ellsworth. He said we did, and they'll let us have a supply. So for medical assistance in this situation, again, Ronnie came to the rescue. This is an interesting situation that occurred. I apologize for the quality of this photograph. It was taken by George Lowe, but this is the inside of Shackleton Base. You can see quite a despondent group here. That's Fuchs. They're awaiting word on the fate of Gordon Haslop and Dr. Alan Rogers, who are now 9 days overdue on a flight from Shackleton Base to Halley Bay. They'd been forced down by weather, and they were basically lost for over 9 days. It went on another 2 or 3 days. And Fuchs spoke to Finn Ronnie, and Finn Ronnie said right away they'd be more than pleased to fly a search flight if necessary. As it turned out, those drugs were delivered to Shackleton and then flown from Shackleton up to Halley Bay by John Lewis. So there was a lot of interaction between the Americans and the New Zealand team and the British team. Here's another one. This was a highlight for the British TAE party. They flew the Otter first trip across the continent with a single engine plane, non-stop. Well, they didn't get there the first time. The first attempt, they got about a third of the way, and the weather turned, and they had to turn back. And they ended going back to South Ice. On December 30th, we had an unexpected call from South Ice. John Lewis said he was short of gasoline for a second attempt. And he very much needed our assistance in flying to South Ice 3 drums of gas that were down at Shackleton. Had Lewis gone down to Shackleton to get it, he would have used 3 drums of ice getting there and getting back to South Ice. So Ronnie again said sure, delivered the fuel, aviation fuel, to South Ice, and this Otter flight was then able to be completed. So in the minutes where this event, the minutes of the London committee meeting where this is celebrated, there's no mention, of course, of any American involvement. And lastly, this is an American Neptune plane here, jet. There was a major health issue with the geophysicist Jeffrey Pratt, who suffered between the South Pole and Depot 700 after they'd reached the pole, heading towards Scott Base, suffered a serious case of carbon monoxide poisoning. He was turning blue. They thought they'd lose him, and Fuchs records, "For these reasons, I feel I have no alternative but to ask Admiral Dufek if he can fly him out to sea level at Scott Base." Now, Dufek wasn't able to do that. The jets were not able to land at the point where this was happening. So what Dufek did, they airdropped a large cylinder of oxygen using this plane here to the party, and 24 hours later, Jeffrey Pratt had recovered. Had that not happened, given the altitude they were at, it would have taken another 10 to 14 days for Pratt to recover from that condition. If Fuchs had been delayed another 10 to 14 days, he would never have got out of Scott Base that season. This made it possible for them not to have to spend another 6 months down on the ice. So my conclusion is the following. Without American aid from the US Navy, in a multitude of forms and circumstances, there were several others, the TAE would have taken on a very different shape, and its outcomes would have been severely constrained, if not altogether abandoned. It was an accident of timing that the IGY, which is why the US were there, and the TAE converged. The TAE had originally planned to leave a year earlier, but it wasn't able to do that. And without the US presence, the journey of Fuchs and his tractors with Hillary's assistance would have been more heroic, especially when you don't have a photograph of Fuchs at the pole being presented with a cake celebrating his arrival by the American chef at the South Pole Station. He would have met a situation, an area very similar to what Scott met 40 years earlier. So it's hard to ignore the contribution that the United States made to the TAE. Now I'd like to move on to the dash to the pole. It wasn't really a dash. It took 83 days for Hillary to get to the South Pole from Scott Base. It took 99 for Fuchs to cross the continent. So they were each doing different things. Fuchs was doing seismic work, geophysical work all the way across. Hillary was establishing depots. But nevertheless, it got called the dash to the pole. The dash didn't occur until a little bit later. Admiral Dufek was again a prime, if you like, supporter of this effort, although at this stage he indicated to Hillary that he didn't think he was going to make it. But there were premonitions about this trip, and I'd like to just touch on a couple of those. This is a letter. I talked about Hillary's letter to Arthur Helm from Paris, 1955. In that letter, where he talked about the American presence being overwhelming, he also said, "The expedition should have sufficient supplies and equipment so that if organization and time permits, or an emergency occurs, the party could travel out as far as the South Pole." Right there. It doesn't get any clearer than that yet. You know, it didn't seem to have any effect. Yesterday I had some useful discussion with Fuchs. Didn't they talk about this? Didn't seem to be a matter of particular importance. Even earlier, a year later, but before the expedition, 16th of July, 1956, George Laking, the Deputy Minister of External Affairs, wrote a letter to Frank Corner in London. In practical matters, however, Hillary, has never paid undue deference to London's views, so he knew him a little bit. And I am sure he will continue to rely principally on his own usually sound judgment. I think the idea of reaching the pole itself is still in his mind. But in view of the relative strength of the New Zealand party, I don't think we should discourage him. So, you know, the idea was floating. But it's a mystery to me why there's no record of Fuchs and Hillary or Bowden and the RSC talking about this possibility. It was so far out of their minds. A, it wasn't part of the original plan. B, how could he ever do it? They underestimated his ingenuity there. And so it never became a topic of discussion, which was a shame in a way. There's the Ross Sea Committee, a group up in Wellington, having their formal session. Now, Hillary actually didn't have a very good relationship with the Ross Sea Committee. In fact, he and Bowden really didn't get on. I would say even less than Hillary and Fuchs got on. Bowden was the ultimate backseat driver. And this is 9th of January 1957, just after the New Zealand party had struggled to find an alternate base for Scott Base, an alternate location. Butter Point had proved unusable, and they finally found that they could use Pram Point. 3 days later, this comes in from Bowden. Now today your signal has come advising you've decided to establish a base at Pram Point. Needless to say, I'm surprised at this change of plan. I would have thought there would be obvious advantages in being on the mainland. You know, this is from a fellow in Wellington who'd never seen the Antarctic, starting to question, you know, implicitly, if not explicitly, why did you put it on Pram Point, you know? Meanwhile, Hillary's got a few things to think about. Like, where are we going to eat tonight, you know? Now, another example of this attitude came a bit later. In Guy Warren, who was a geologist on the expedition, in his diary, he explains, tonight Ed had a long cable from Bowden, commenting on the summer's plans. Well, Ed had produced this, and I have a copy of it. It's a big plan with all the columns and the timing and the different sledging parties. And he included his tractor party as well. And he sent that to the Ross Sea Committee, and this is what he got back. Watched Bob reading it, Bob Miller, an exceedingly mild man, but he just about had apoplexy. The ideal is apparently for half the party to sit here sunbathing for 5 months, while the other half go out to the last depot and stay there playing bridge and guarding it from theft until Fuchs arrives. This was just the reaction of Guy Warren to this message from Bowden. Here's what Bowden said. Bernie Gunn quotes this. Bowden prescribed a limited amount of exploration may be carried out in true Antarctic tradition within a distance not exceeding 15 miles of the depots. Now, when you look at the 1,400-mile trip that Bob Miller and George Marsh did with their dogs, surveying, and the Northern Party, which was almost as extensive, and the Darwin Party, you can see where, you know, this sort of thing coming in from Wellington might cause some discussion. Hillary overnight sent the following reply as politely as he could. The deployment of field personnel is best left in the hands of the field executive, who are at least in a position to appreciate the problems and capabilities of the people concerned. And at this point, Ed began to ignore the Ross Sea Committee. Now, the Ross Sea Committee still went on, and on the 18th of November 1957, which was a month after Ed left from Scott Base with his tractors, they decided to talk about it in their minutes in their meeting. And here's what came up. Ernest Marsden, who was a member of the committee, Dr. Marsden asked whether Sir Edmund Hillary was going to the pole. Wow. That's a good, this is 2 years after Hillary sent that letter to Arthur Helm. Somebody asks, is he going to the pole? It was pointed out that the original instructions did not cover that extension. Dr. Marsden and Mr. Ritterford then desired to be placed on record as expressing the opinion that Sir Edmund Hillary should be free to go to the pole if he found himself able to do so and wished to make the journey. So at least there were 2 supporters for the trip on the Ross Sea Committee. Not everyone supported it. So it goes on. This came in from Bowden a little later in December. At this point, Ed and the Tractor Party were establishing Depot 480, and we're about to move on to 700. Congratulations from Bowden. But then he adds, overriding consideration is nothing should be done that involves any risk whatever. From this it follows that Depot 700 must not be left unmanned, since experience proves this may make it impossible to find under certain climatic conditions. Now, I don't know how Bowden knew that, but I expect that Hillary knew it as well. And Ed could not have thought other than that, I don't know if I really need this. Well, Bowden, just to finish this off here, was asked by a reporter whether Hillary was going to the pole, and all Bowden could say, well, he's going apparently. So the relationship there was basically non-existent. Now, Hillary showed some hesitation here. This is in his diary, 21st of December. Now, on the 21st of December, Hillary was at Depot 700. He's learned that Fuchs is going to be late. And he says, I'm a bit aghast at their delay. It's quite apparent that any mad dash to the pole at the moment would be a bit premature. So I'll have to quell my ambitions and do the best that I can for Bunny. So, Ed never forgot that was part of his job. Oh well, we've had a good run, so I can't complain, I suppose. I've sent a pretty insubordinate note to the Ross Sea Committee, but they can fire me if they like. This is the note he sent here, because Bowden had asked him, what are you doing? What are your plans? And Ed replied, anything we can do this side of the pole to expedite Fuchs's progress will increase the safety factor of his party. Establishing an effective route through the area south of here, Depot 700, will permit of much faster traveling. I have conveyed this information to Fuchs for his comments and should get his reply in the near future. In the interim, we will push on to the best of our ability. So this was Ed telling Bowden, I'm going south. Now, just a few more of these sorts of messages. Again, on the 21st of December was a very intense period here of messaging and communication. This came from Bowden to Hillary. Before commenting on these earlier telegrams, 3 of them, and whether your projected movements fit in with the requirements outlined therein, meanwhile, you should not proceed beyond Depot 700. And in his diary, Ed wrote, "He certainly is playing tough." Then he sends a message to Bowden. "All your messages received and understood, but consider we cannot afford to waste the best days of summer sitting at depots." Then there's a real change here. Same day. So it shows that there was communication with London going on at the same time about all of this. London Committee have indicated they are happy to fall in with any modifications of original plans which have been agreed between Fuchs and yourself. Expedition is arousing great interest and receiving magnificent publicity both in the United Kingdom and New Zealand. Good luck. So, you know, Bowden was being torn between his conservatism and the fact that publicity was very important for the TAE, particularly the sponsors, who were the Times of London and the book publishers, because it was very important to have some interest in this expedition for them. And this is the sort of publicity they were talking about. Is Hillary going to the pole? This was on December 22nd. And then it became a race. So all of that to say that Hillary's decision worked well, but that the Ross Sea Committee were dragged kicking and screaming into supporting it. Now, Depot 700 is right here. This is Scott Base down here. And December 21st, we were at Depot 700. That's 500 miles. And now we're going to move to about here, because that's where the next exchange occurs, another 200 miles towards the pole. This is a photo of the tractor train heading south. Bowden didn't give up. He's continuing to pester Hillary. The message, this is on the 26th of December now, the messages we have received leave us in doubt as to your precise plans. Please answer the following questions. Did Fuchs agree to your going to the pole? 2, having reached the pole, do you intend to return by air? Or will you wait and return with Fuchs, thus giving him guidance over the route by which you came? This is called micromanagement, by the way. 3, will you abandon your tractors at the pole or attempt to run them back to Scott Base? Note that they belong to Ferguson's and not to us. You know, they were given free. Anyway, 4, what type of fuel? What type of fuel will you use on the journey? How much will be required, and from what source will it come? And here's Ed's reply. My plan is to arrive at the pole as soon as we can get there. Answers to your questions are: 1, made no comment. 2, await Fuchs and see what he requires. 3, abandon tractors unless Fuchs requires them. 4, TAE fuel if tractors used by Fuchs. Ed wasn't particularly concerned as to whether he used BP fuel or other fuel. It was a big issue because BP were a major sponsor, and Fuchs didn't want any of the photographs or films to show anything but a BP logo on those drums. And when it did, it raised a huge amount of concern, which is another story. So you can see the very terse reply that Ed Hillary gave here. Now, just as a backdrop, this map was printed in the newspaper before the expedition, during the expedition, but before all of what we've talked about. But the map shows the planned dates for Fuchs to travel. He was intended to be at South Ice on November the 27th. Well, he didn't get there till December the 24th. He was a month late. He was supposed to be at the South Pole on December the 21st. He didn't get there till January the 19th. He's basically running 3 to 4 weeks late from this point onwards. He had a very difficult time going up here. And Ed Hillary, he was about there on December 21st he was there. Now, it's unfortunate that the timing worked that way because it really sort of messed things up. How wonderful would it have been if Fuchs could have arrived at the pole at the same time as Hillary? It would have been a massive celebration. But it just didn't work out that way because even though Fuchs had planned to be there, he was just running late. And as a result, Ed was here on December 28th. He was about there, 300 miles from the pole. And this is 600 miles. Fuchs was just leaving. So there was just no way for that to happen. And you know, the idea of Hillary waiting at Depot 700 doesn't make a lot of sense. But I think that original plan was based on the fact that A, Fuchs would travel much more quickly. He had the big snowcats. And that New Zealand would be using dog teams, not Ferguson's, not tractors. And Ed would be flown in to Depot 700 to meet Fuchs. Things turned out quite a bit differently. There's Admiral Dufek at Hillary with Hillary at the pole with Blizzard. This photograph is from Syracuse University. That's where the files for Dufek's papers are stored at Syracuse University in the United States. On the back of this photograph is a message written by Dufek. This is my favorite picture. And these two fellows got along very, very well. Now, what are the reactions to this trip to the pole? Well, here's an interesting one from Dr. Francis de Hamel. It's at the Hawken Library in his diary. He was the doctor during this, with the summer party and was present during all of this was going on. He was present at Scott Base. I have a lot of sympathy for Ed Hillary. We all knew before he set out from Scott Base if he'd had time to spare, he'd press on towards the pole, despite the agreement that he should remain at Depot 700 and wait for Fuchs. But when it came to the crunch, he really didn't have any great options. The Antarctic ain't a healthy place to hang about in for weeks inside a caboose, to wait for a meeting that might never eventuate, and certainly wouldn't if Fuchs became much further delayed. I think we all agreed the man on the ground was the only person who could say whether the decision to go for the pole was or was not wise, stupid, sensible, foolhardy, pragmatic, self-seeking, thoughtful, thoughtless, prudent, risky, and so on. We argued these pros and cons for hours while it was all happening. And there are just as many opinions as to whether it was the right or not the right thing for Ed to do. And other files that I've looked at, you get opinions from one end of the spectrum to the other. Now, that was the trip to the pole, which was fine. Fuchs later in an interview in 1980 said, I had no problem with Ed going to the pole. I knew he was thinking about it, and that didn't disturb me at all. But this did disturb Fuchs. And what this is, it came out in the press in this form, deep split between Fuchs and Hillary. Here's what caused that. While he was approaching the pole, Ed, in his diary, had this thought, began to doubt that Fuchs could get to Scott Base in time to board the ship and head to New Zealand. So in his diary, he explained it this way: if Bunny is as late as I think he'll be, I'll try and persuade him to abandon his effort for this year and fly out with the Yanks. Then fly back in next year and complete the run. So the idea was born in his mind on that night. Now later on, when he was at the pole, or just about to approach the pole, it was one day before, he got a request from Fuchs for two of the mechanics, Jim Bates and the engineer Murray Ellis, to accompany him to Scott Base from the South Pole. Fuchs asked for Murray Ellis and Jim Bates to join his party. They both refused. Both of my mechanics regard such a late journey as an unjustifiable risk and are not prepared to wait and travel with your party. You have to understand they'd also just spent 83 days getting to the South Pole in Ferguson's. They probably weren't really looking forward to a return journey and when they could be flown out, you know. Anyway, and here Hillary gives Fuchs his recommendation. I agree with their view and think you should seriously consider splitting your journey over 2 years. Now, Fuchs replied immediately, I appreciate your concern, but there can be no question of abandoning the journey at this stage. We will therefore have to wend our own way. And that's fine. That was two leaders communicating with each other, one giving a suggestion, the other saying, I reject it, and let's get on with it. Okay, it didn't end there though. Then, Hillary, I think, might have made a faux pas here. He sent a message directly to the London Committee of Management from the South Pole. And he copied the Ross Sea Committee, he copied Bowden on it. In that letter he says, enough prestige will have been gained by the arrival of Fuchs and ourselves at the South Pole. Your instructions to tell Fuchs to abandon the journey are the only thing that can enable Fuchs to save face and adopt a modified plan. So I would earnestly request that the management committee should give this matter its earliest consideration. So he went straight to basically Fuchs's superiors with his recommendation that Fuchs had already rejected. He was a bit desperate, I think, in taking that step. Here's what happened in the London Committee of Management meeting when those messages arrived. Admiral Parry, who was their secretary, read out the two messages, and there was complete and absolute stunned silence, while Frank Corner looked acutely miserable and stared into his lap. You can imagine the tension that it would have raised in London when these messages arrived. One of the members of the COM, Sir Edwin Herbert, stated, there can be no countenancing of anyone else's view at all, much less those of a young man who has just done one polar journey with a couple of farm tractors. So they dismissed Hillary's recommendation outright. And Eleanor Honeywell, who was the PA to Fuchs, she was present at this meeting, and these are her notes. Finally, Frank Corner murmured rather miserably that he felt sure that Ed had meant well. And Slessor, the chairman, exploded, what the hell has prestige got to do with anything, and what is all this nonsense about face saving? Slessor was a pretty dynamic and expressive sort of a person, so without question, London said no to that recommendation. But even with this, it could have been glossed over in a way, but there was a problem in that this message here got into the press. The copy to Bowden was actually mistakenly viewed as to be given to the press. And that led to those headlines. London didn't know it had become public at this stage, but when they did, it got pretty serious. And you got these headlines. The Times was a sponsor of the TAE. This is in the Daily Mail. They didn't care. They were selling newspapers. And that's what it did. So this row took a while to settle down. There was a lot of communication, as you can imagine. It did show the difficulties, of communication between three parties in this sort of a project, as well as the personalities of the leaders involved. After it was all over, however, Slessor sent a message to Fuchs. We reiterate complete confidence in you and our support in whatever you decide to do. Your decision should not be influenced by any considerations of prestige or possible financial commitments. So the London Com gave Fuchs their 100% support. The same cannot be said for Charles Bowden and the Ross Sea Committee with Sir Edmund Hillary, which is unfortunate. And then, however, Slessor didn't totally dismiss or ignore the warning that Hillary's suggestion brought forward. And he sent this message to Bowden. A factor which seems to me must have the greatest weight with Fuchs in making up his mind to proceed or not is availability of the 4 New Zealand dog teams at Depot 700. We must avoid any risk of the party having to winter on the plateau. Even if worse comes to worse, Fuchs could reach Scott Base if he has 6 dog teams. He would have to winter at Scott Base, but that is acceptable. Fuchs didn't have a problem with wintering at Scott Base. He'd done that sort of thing before. Hillary had no intention of wintering at Scott Base. So, London started to worry and said, we maybe need to set up a contingency for Fuchs in case he doesn't make it. This was never enacted. It never had to be utilized. In fact, Hillary replied that dog teams at Depot 700 was a non-starter. And in his reply, he told the Ross Sea Committee, who then told London, the only rescue that Fuchs can expect once he leaves Depot 700 is from the U.S. Navy. I'm not sure that went down too well. Anyway, 2 weeks later, on the 19th of January, there we have the 2 leaders shaking hands at the South Pole. So a lot happened between Fuchs's arrival, Hillary's arrival at the pole on the 4th of January, and Fuchs's arrival at the South Pole on the 19th of January. And Fuchs said, "Damn glad to see you, Ed." And then Hillary was flown back to Scott Base to wait until Fuchs got to Depot 700. Then he was flown out to Depot 700. Now, the legacy of the TAE. Scientific research, survey, Trans-Antarctic Association, a catalyst for future expeditions, Scott Base, relationship with the U.S. program and the National Science Foundation, and establishing the New Zealand Antarctic presence. When it comes to scientific research, the TAE produced 15 reports. Here's 4 of them. One is by Ron Ballum on meteorology. This one is survey, and that's by Ken Blakelock and David Stratton and Bob Miller on the surveying. This is the seismic soundings across Antarctica, which was the purpose of the expedition in Fuchs's view. And this one is geology. Now this is interesting, Bernie Gunn and Guy Warren. This is a major report, number 11. And The survey parties were really the most significant contribution that, in many ways, the New Zealand party made in covering all of these areas, thousands and thousands of square miles of territory in the Ross Sea region. The Northern Party, Gunn, Warren, Brooke, Douglas, 14,000 square miles. The Darwin Party, which included Bill Cranfield for a good part of it, 10,000 square miles. Southern Party, Miller and Marsh, they traveled 1,470 miles and covered an equally large area. So in total, probably 40,000 square miles of terrain. Now this book here is a 2012 book, the Report on the Geology of Southern Victoria Land, published in 2012. This updated the work done previously during the TAE. It hadn't been updated since 1962. And in the opening, there's a tribute to Bernie Gunn and Guy Warren for the work they did back in 1957-58. And that work lasted until 2012 as the standard, and only just recently got updated. So that's a very significant contribution there. And then we have, of course, Scott Base itself. So you can read that. That's basically it. The contribution, the legacy of the expedition is I think, exceptional and is deserving of lasting celebration, really. And you know, it is existent in the fact that Scott Base continues today and will continue far into the future, and New Zealand has occupied and accepted its heritage there, and now plays a major role in the management of that significant part of the world. So thank you very much. I hope you found it of interest and that there were a few new nuances that you might have picked up. And I am going to await a phone call from Brian Story to put together part 3. Thank you very much.